Welcome, Professor True. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you today and to enjoy the possibility of discussing with you the challenges of women, peace and security agenda in the framework of the WPS Lab project of Sapienza University. This will be the first of a series of interviews to leading experts and personalities related to the themes of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So before starting our conversation, our interview, let me say a few words to introduce you. Our guest, Jackie True, is a professor of international relations and director of Monash University Center for Gender, Peace and Security. She has authored several books, articles, and book chapters with her work on gender mainstreaming, global governance, violence against women, women, peace and securities, and feminist methodologies. Her current research is focused on specific areas of relevance to the broader women, peace and security agenda, and she recently co-edited with Sarah Davis the Oxford Handbook on Women, Peace and Security. So, Professor True, let's start our interview focusing on the background of the resolution 1325. Would you like to explain why 20 years ago there was the need to adopt a thematic resolution on women, peace and security?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Gianfranco. Why 20 years ago? I would say, why did it take so long to achieve recognition that war and conflict have a different impact on women than on men, on girls than on boys? Surprisingly, at the beginning of the 20th century, women peace activists tried to stop the advent of war in Europe during World War One. They even had a conference in The Hague where women from 12 countries, the United States, Canada, as well as countries from Europe, came together and to try to come up with some key principles to prevent further war. And these women peace activists were active across the continent in talking to communities and families, and soldiers, why war is such a terrible thing. And the surprising thing is because at that time, women did not have citizenship rights, that their ideas about how to achieve peace had no audience, really. They certainly were able to influence some political leaders, but for example, some leaders in France put the women in prison, didn't want to allow them to attend the conference. In the UK, they also tried to prevent passports given to the women to attend the peace conference. So there was a real stifling of women's leadership and women's voices on how to bring about peace. This is 1915, nearly 100 years later. So I would say, why 20 years ago? Why not 100 years ago? Because look at the state of conflict and war in the world. It's not going away. We thought it was decreasing, in the period after World War II, but what we've seen in the last 2 decades is that we do actually have an escalation of violence and war, and that is not when we do not even include the reality of gender-based violence, sexual and gender-based violence, which is endemic in situations of fragility and conflict. So rather than say why 20 years ago was there the need, I said, why did it take so long for states to recognize the importance of achieving gender inclusive peace and security?
20 years ago, Resolution 1325 has been defined by many as a historical resolution. Can we say that its value goes beyond the realm of international peace and security?
Absolutely. 1325, I think, is the only Security Council resolution to have started a worldwide transnational social movement. So, and that social movement in particular of women and men activists wanting to achieve gender equality as the foundation for peace reaches into so many areas of our societies, and not simply those societies affected by conflict. And if we think about the contribution to recognizing gender equality, in addressing all of the challenges and crises that we face in our world, you know, climate change, violent extremism, poverty, inequality, health pandemics, to mention the most recent, you know, Resolution 1325 is a relevant framework for addressing all of those crises, because it tries to harness all of the potentials, women and men, to prevent crisis. It's very much focused on prevention, not on acting to crises in an emergency scenario, but building the foundations of, you know, human rights, social and economic justice, and cooperation within and across states and non-state actors to be able to prevent crises. So it's an agenda that is relevant to all understandings of security, and certainly beyond the strict definition of international peace and security as the UN Security Council might define it. And I think just lastly, one important point is to mention that, you know, this year we're not only celebrating 20 years or commemorating 20 years of women, peace and security as an agenda and a cross-cutting agenda in the Security Council, we're also commemorating 25 years since the Beijing Platform for Action and the Beijing Conference in China, where women from around the world, not only on government delegations, but in non-governmental organizations, came together to chart the most far-reaching commitment to gender equality, and to gender equality, which actually transforms our ability to achieve all our common goals. So I like to see that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is in a way a child of the Beijing Platform for Action.
20 years after the adoption of the resolution 1325 today, we can take stock of the progress made. What are, in your opinion, the strengths of the agenda, and what are the weaknesses?
That's a great question, and a really important question to reflect on this year. So I think the first strength of the Women, Peace and Security agenda has been, you know, to recognize women as peace builders and women's leadership in bringing about peace. And I think that as a result of the agenda, this recognition actually reaches far and wide now. And if I think about the region in which I live, Asia Pacific, you know, we can see now that those women, often in communities, conflict-affected, fragile communities, who are doing that hard work every day of trying to avert conflict, trying to prevent violence, trying to really mediate in their communities, they are actually, that work is now recognized. Now, it's not fully supported, but it is recognized. And the fact that today we can say that even these women peace builders can come to the Security Council and brief, you know, key representatives of states on the conflict situation, on the situation in their countries and their communities directly, and that they bring a distinct perspective, not only a perspective on the negative impacts of crises, but a distinct perspective on how we can, you know, mitigate the crises, how we can avert the crises. So I think that's a really important strength of the agenda. And I think the fact that we now see that recognition of the importance of having women in all peace and security institutions. And I'm not talking about, you know, just peace builders at the community level, but I'm also talking about women in peacekeeping forces. The importance there of having, you know, of moving beyond and almost a militarized focus on peacekeeping and recognizing that actually peacekeeping requires a lot of different capabilities, and that men and women do well to become good peace builders while they are, you know, uniformed and bearing arms. And that I think we have seen a recognition of, you know, that delivering peace and security by peacekeepers needs to be more inclusive. So if I think again about Asia Pacific, we've gone from having no women peacekeepers at all in 2000 to having nearly 1,000. And that is a significant strength and achievement. And I would say that women's participation in delivering security actually is transformative of that security, because they also bring a different skill set. They actually change the dynamics of group, the overall group of peacekeepers. So that's a couple of points there, and I think there are others. I would say the greatest weaknesses are, you know, the real limitations to the full implementation of the agenda, especially with regard to gender-based violence. Despite the fact that we've had a lot of attention to the way in which gender-based violence fuels conflict. It's used as a weapon of war, but it also fuels conflict, and it continues after the formal resolution to conflict, okay? And often it spikes, and often it is women who may have lost their family members, their partners, their incomes, their homes, their communities, who actually then, you know, suffer even greater precarity and violence. The fact that, you know, still all of those parties who are named for being perpetrators of this violence in conflict situations continue to perpetrate, despite being named on the Secretary General list annually, that is a real concern. And I think the fact that states think it's primarily a problem of non-state actors and not uniformed state militaries, that is a problem. And I think, you know, this is really, this is not a problem that's going away. In fact, we see more and more groups using sexual and gender-based violence as a strategy of war, okay? And we see it diffusing as a very common strategy of terrorist and violent extremist groups. And we see now, even in civil wars, we see the explicit targeting of women and women, politically active women, women leaders, for this type of violence. So I think that's a real, the weakness is that the agenda has not been able to stop or reduce the violence. And I think in the next decade, we have got to commit to a target on seriously reducing this violence and seriously sanctioning the perpetrators.
Some authors highlight that the resolution is too oriented towards the prevention of violence against women instead of the participation pillar. Do you agree on that?
I think the pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda are really an important tool to think about. But I think at the same time, participation versus protection, there is no division. The agenda, both are integral to one another. And it relates to exactly what I said. In order to, in order to protect all people from human rights violations, to provide inclusive protection, we need women's participation. And in the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the focus on sexual and gender-based violence as frequently, affecting women and girls disproportionately, but also affecting men and boys, in order to develop that protection agenda has required substantial participation by women. So it's required women's participation as protection advisors, as heads of mission, as legal experts, documenting, providing evidence, women's work as, as those who in the health and trauma sector, supporting survivors, and all of those who work throughout the law and justice sector nationally and internationally to support. So the idea that you can have protection without participation is a complete misnomer. They both support one another.
Do the WPA's agenda address in a correct way the need to compromise between a feminist rights-based approach that advocates for women equal participation in peace and security and an instrumental approach that sees gender equality as a mean to the goals of security and stability?
So I don't know if it's the correct way. I think there is no choice. If we want to change the way the world is and we want to seriously prevent conflict and violence, then I think the right thing to do is the smart thing to do. So it just depends on how we persuade people. Some people will be persuaded by the moral imperative to do the right thing, to take seriously the violations of women's human rights. Some people will be less persuaded by the rights case and will need a really an instrumental imperative. How will this improve the likelihood of reducing conflict and societies, falling back into conflict again and costing a lot of money and creating mayhem and instability? So I think that pragmatic approach, a trial and error approach, must be to use both the rights-based and the instrumental cases to build the movement for peace and security, for inclusive peace and security. And that people may change their behavior based on the idea that actually including women in peace processes will actually have a better outcome. We might actually get a sustainable peace. They will get on board with that if they see, the evidence, they see that it works. And then over time, they will have an opportunity to see, yes, okay, that was the right thing to do. Yes, yes, those women actually, this has actually made a phenomenal difference to the recovery of this society. So I think peace and security has grown and flourished in part because of the pragmatism of the agenda, the way it can bring on board people from different sectors, different backgrounds, and with different institutional prerogatives.
Your researches address some fundamental questions on the topic of WPS. One of them is, should we persist with a mainstream agenda that seeks compromise rather than revolution? So what is your opinion on that? How is it possible to pursue the mainstreaming of WPS without undermining essential reforms?
Yeah, it's a catch-22, mainstreaming or revolution. But of course, as we know, there's no short revolution, right? I love the Chinese who say that they're still waiting to see the result of the French Revolution. And what I would say is that women, peace and security is the longest revolution, okay? This is a more than a century-long struggle. And that what's most important in seeking to integrate the ideas of gender, peace and security, or gender equality, gender inclusion and peace and security, is that we keep the core values intact. And those are human rights values, but they're also values of justice and gender justice. And I think that in the process of mainstreaming, we want many different perspectives. We want many different groups to have access to contestation, to be able to speak to the agenda, to contest aspects of the agenda, to push it forward, because that's how we make progress. We don't make progress if we all agree. We make progress when we all agree to debate and to find the solution. So there is no revolution. The revolution is now, and it is about being part of the movement for the next generation.
Succeeding resolutions on WPS have broadened the scope of the agenda beyond the original themes of the resolution 1325. So we can make reference to cross-cutting issues such as terrorism, violent extremism, and climate-induced displacement. Is this a positive evolution, or is there a risk of widening the scope so much as to dilute the original objectives of the agenda?
Great question. I'm definitely on the side of continuing to build and broaden the agenda. And I think all of the sort of security threats, and especially, which are also threats to women's security in particular, have a specific gender dimension. For example, the impacts of climate change on women in communities who largely have no voice in the decision making, but nonetheless watch the changes in the weather, are working to mitigate them and the food supply in their communities. Violent extremism and terrorism, where these groups are actively recruiting men and women with very distinct strategies designed to kind of, in a way, target their messages so that they manipulate, the particular oppressions, including the gender oppressions experienced by women, or the failure of men to be able to afford a wife given bride price and other pressures. So all of these security issues will be addressed by the existing 4 pillars of women, peace and security. They all can be addressed by the participation of women and men, the equal participation, by preventing, gender-based violence as a factor that fuels conflict, by attending to gender-responsive relief and recovery so that post-conflict societies do not continue to have grievances which grow into the next generation. For example, when single-headed female households have to raise sons who then are recruited into violent extremist groups because they are so poor, they are so marginalized in their societies. And finally, the protection agenda, gender-based violence, we know is exacerbated in all of those by all of those security threats, in situations of terrorism, in situations of health pandemics, and in situations where societies are displaced by conflict-induced disasters. So, in fact, it's not an expansion of the agenda. It's an expansion of how we understand security and the threats to security.
What are the future prospects for the WPS agenda for the next 20 years?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I think we have to be. You had a famous Italian theorist, was it Gramsci, who, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, and I'm with Gramsci on that. I think for the next 20 years, we can be very optimistic about women, peace and security, because look at how far it has come. Look at the transnational community of activists, policymakers, and scholars who are all focused on this agenda and critically focused on how to advance the agenda and how to, overcome its shortcomings, its obstacles, and its challenges. So I'm very optimistic about the next generation. I am a teacher, and I teach an undergraduate class which is substantially focused on this agenda and bringing a gender perspective to international relations. I have over 200 students in this class, men and women. At Monash University, we have a PhD program in gender, peace and security. And I'm happy to say we have students from 18 countries, over 30 students. So I can see that a lot of young people are actually developing careers focused on this agenda. And I think that says something, that we have built a community of practice. And we can expect that human beings who devote themselves to something creatively and who are now embedded in institutions, not only universities, but also in governments, in key humanitarian organizations and in the UN, by collaborating together and focusing on some key goals, I think we can achieve a lot. And I would like to say, given that women, peace and security also intersects with the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 5 on gender equality and Goal 16 on good governance and peace, I think that focusing in the next 2 decades on reducing gender-based violence in half and increasing women's participation in peace and security, doubling it, I think this would be very tangible goals that we can all work towards. And I'd like to say that in universities, we're building the foundation for that. And, it's unstoppable.
Thank you very much, Professor True, for dedicating your time to this interview. And thank you also for your inspiring words and original insights on the issue of women, peace and security. Our interview now has come to an end, but I'm sure that your words will be food for thoughts for our audience. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the opportunity.